Hey there, this is your teacher, Mr. H, and you're watching History in a Hoodie. Today's episode is about the leaders of the Civil Rights Movement, where we will learn all about who pushed civil rights forward and who pushed back against the movement. I can't wait to find out, so let's get this show started. What are we learning about today? The standard for today's lesson asks the students to describe the role of individuals, Martin Luther King Jr. and John Lewis, groups, SNCC and SCLC, and events, the Albany Movement and the March on Washington, in the Civil Rights Movement. Also, we will explain the resistance to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, emphasizing the role of Lester Maddox. Before we start, let's go over some vocabulary for today's lesson. SNCC is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, a student-led civil rights organization. The NAACP is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, an organization working for the betterment of people of color. The SCLC is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a civil rights organization led by Martin Luther King Jr. Civil rights means the rights of citizens to political and social freedom and equality. Boycott means withdrawing from shopping or relating with businesses, persons, or organizations as a punishment or form of protest. The March on Washington was a political demonstration to show support for major civil rights legislation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was the law that ended segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was the law that eliminated various discriminatory tactics used to restrict voting by black people. The civil rights movement started to take its roots in the traditionally black colleges and universities and Christian churches in the South. This isn't too surprising because well-educated individuals and passionate believers starting a movement are exactly the type of people needed to make an enduring change last. Dr. Benjamin Mays had his toes in both ponds, both as a Baptist preacher and as a professor at Morehouse College in Atlanta. Mays had spent some time with Mohandas Gandhi in India and shared those ideas of nonviolence with his class. Sitting in that classroom was a young man whom would become his mentee in protest and change, Martin Luther King Jr. In 1955, a young African-American woman was arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white woman on a crowded, segregated bus. The NAACP was looking for a story to turn into a media frenzy to spark a bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. Claudette Colvin was this young lady, and she was pregnant and unmarried, so the NAACP decided to go with Rosa Parks instead. Much of the efforts of the civil rights movement was focused on changing minds through either positive media coverage or through economic strife, the hallmarks of nonviolent protest. The Montgomery bus boycott was a protest against the public transportation in a highly segregated city. All blacks boycotting the buses would put economic strain on the transportation system, and having Parks, an elderly and kindly lady, being manhandled by police would cover the media side of things. To keep the boycott together, the movement would need an inspirational leader, and that would come in the form of a young Baptist minister, King. King took the lead of a few civil rights groups, including the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC, and was a big supporter of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. These groups of students, churchgoers, and their supporters made up the bulk of the resistance. And while a large portion of these groups were African American, by the 60s and 70s there began to be more and more white supporters of civil rights. King's leadership over the Montgomery bus boycott led to segregated busing in Montgomery being declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, a major victory. King turned his eyes to other areas of gross injustice in the South following Montgomery. Lunch counter sit-ins to protest segregated restaurants, marches to protest unfair treatment by law enforcement and the court system. His supporters would be peacefully arrested in droves, so many that the jails would have to turn away those arrested because the jail cells were filled up. While many of these movements were successful causing change in isolated pockets in the South, one major failure of King's was the Albany movement. In 1961, SNCC invited King to Albany, Georgia, a tiny town in the southwest of the state. Attempting to desegregate a deeply segregated town, SNCC was struggling to make any changes and called in the big kahuna MLK. King and his supporters were arrested multiple times, and the police chief was able to claim a victory when King left after failing to desegregate any facilities. King learned from his failures in Albany, notably unfocused protest and demands, and trying to fix everything all at once, and continued his show on the road. In Washington, D.C., King gave his infamous I Have a Dream speech, where he stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and told the president and Congress exactly what the civil rights movement stood for: equal treatment for all, voting rights for all, one shared community. Another famous Georgian, John Lewis, was at the March on Washington speech in 1963 and took King's words to heart. Lewis, along with SNCC, led a march on Selma, Alabama to register new voters in the Deep South. While marching over the Edmund Pettus Bridge into town, state troopers brutally beat Lewis and his followers live on TV. The event became known as Bloody Sunday and brought much-needed attention to the movement in the Deep South. Lewis, undeterred, went straight from his hospital bed and marched over the same bridge again 2 days later, with even more supporters and MLK as well. Lewis was arrested 45 times during the Civil Rights Movement, and in 2011, President Obama awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his leadership in the movement. Today, John Lewis is representing Georgia in the U.S. House and is the longest-running congressman from Georgia, still fighting for equality. All of the protesting, marching, sit-ins, arrests, and violent deaths finally led up to action by the U.S. government. President Kennedy was in charge during most of the civil rights protesting. However, he was assassinated, leaving President Lyndon B. Johnson to lead the government through the passing of civil rights laws. In 1964, the U.S. government passed the Civil Rights Act, which ended segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination. In 1965, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, which enforced the rights of the 15th Amendment by banning all forms of disenfranchisement tactics, including poll taxes, literacy tests, etc. U.S. law was changed almost 60 years ago to make discrimination and racism illegal. Just because laws change doesn't mean all people change. So we must continue to work day in and day out to fight for equality for all people in our community, following the lead of great Americans like King and Lewis. So what? How did Georgian politicians respond to the civil rights movement? During this great period of social and political change, a new segregationist governor in Georgia would take power: Lester Maddox. Maddox owned and operated a restaurant near Georgia Tech, where he would openly only serve white customers. He was well known for using axe handles or a gun to chase blacks out of his restaurant who were trying to integrate. Maddox eventually closed his restaurant rather than serve blacks. He used his refusal to serve under the cloud of the Civil Rights Act as a part of his campaign running for governor. Because in Georgia, rebelling against the U.S. government and fighting against civil rights would, of course, win you governor. Ironically, as the last segregationist governor in the state's history, Maddox hired more blacks to government positions than any prior Georgia governors, which wasn't saying much, but it's something. Maddox would go on to run for president in 1976 as an independent segregationist. However, it would be a different Georgian who would go on to win that election, someone much worthier of Georgians' pride. Now what? What am I going to do with this information? I don't know how many of you are interested in politics in your future, or maybe it's something you might decide to try out later on in life, but being elected to statewide or national offices is an easy way to end up in history books. Think about some of the names we've talked about this year: Talmadge, Eugene and Herman, Jackson, Tom Watson, and now Lester Maddox. There are some leaders who clearly come out on the wrong side of history when we look back after a few decades. I saw a quote on a Facebook post recently that said, "To those who have experienced nothing but privilege, equality seems like a punishment." So you can kind of understand why the Talmadges and Maddoxes of the world behave the way they do. However, these people always end up looking like the villains in our history, while the Kings, Lewises, Mandelas, and Gandhis always come out heroes. Why? Because King was fighting for people, while Maddox was fighting for privilege and greed. Equality is going to win out. That's a fact. There have been conflicts across history where one racial group was discriminated against only for acceptance to eventually come. In its earliest days of the United States, the first prejudices were against the Irish, Italians, and Jews. It was the freedmen in the late 1800s through civil rights, and the Japanese during World War II. Now, there are ongoing debates about immigrants, LGBT groups, Arab Americans, and other groups that don't experience America the same way as the privileged. Change will eventually come. Equality will eventually prevail. You don't want to be the grandfather or grandmother that their kids never invite to Thanksgiving because they know you will be the one to spout off something ignorant and racist at dinner. Make sure you end up on the right side of history by supporting equality. Wow, so learning about the civil rights movement is really important for us to understand. I'm glad we learned it today. Are you ready for some review questions? Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. worked very hard to do away with racial segregation in the 1950s and 1960s. What was Dr. King's strategy for promoting social change? The March on Washington was intended to... The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, headquartered in Atlanta, was... What became known as Bloody Sunday? Who became governor of Georgia a few years after closing his restaurant to avoid desegregating it? I hope all of you learned a lot from today's episode of History in a Hoodie about the Civil Rights Movement. If you did, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Just kidding, I don't care about that stuff, but do make sure you study this lesson. Bye now.